The images speak for themselves. Can you help viewers here in America understand why the violence has escalated over the past 24 hours?
Well, it escalated initially because the police, who had been away from Taksim Square for more than a week, moved in this morning and started clearing away some of the barricades that the protesters had put up around the square. And in the course of doing that, they got into some clashes with the protesters. And then this afternoon, there was a period of relative calm where the police pulled back to one side of the square and allowed people to come back into it. But then in the last couple of hours, the fighting has broken out again. The police have been using tear gas very heavily around the square. They've been driving the protesters away from the square down side streets around it. And then when the clouds of gas clear, the protesters are trying to move back to the square. So it's actually very similar to the scene on May the 31st, that Friday night, when it all really began here.
Can you tell us, Ben, what is their fundamental complaint against the government right now?
Well, the initial protest began on a fairly small scale over the redevelopment of a park in Istanbul. Right now, the complaint of most of the protesters, I think, has broadened beyond that. And it's about the approach of a government that was elected 2 years ago with a large majority, with 50% of the vote. But the protesters say that the government is now behaving as if it only has to take into account the concerns of people who voted for them and is riding roughshod over the concerns of the other 50% who didn't. And those include things like what the protesters say is unnecessary curbs on alcohol, for example, inspired by religious reasons, and an increasing weight on religion in schools. These are the kind of issues, I think, that are now really motivating people. They feel that the government is using its majority in Parliament to do what it wants.
Is there a danger?
They feel that they're not consulted.
Is there a danger now that this escalates, that more protesters actually join this group as a result of the tear gas, for example, and the growing violence? Will people see that as really a reason now to be part of this as opposed to backing away?
I think to some extent that's already happening tonight. The crowds now around Taksim Square, I think, as large or larger than they've been in the past week. I think that from now on, the problem is not necessarily that the protests will get so much bigger, but that the police and the government have no real way of dispelling the protests, because you fire tear gas at people and they run away, but it clears within a couple of minutes and they come back. And short of completely cordoning off the square again, which happened on the first night of the protest, or short of large-scale arrests, I really don't see how right now the government is going to be able to reassert control over this square, which is right in the middle of it's the Times Square of Turkey. It's right in the middle of the biggest city in the country.
Ben, you say that effectively the protesters represent, to a certain extent, some of the politicians who were defeated a couple of years ago in that election. Can you, for the benefit of the viewers, describe really what the platform would be of that opposition party?
Yeah, I think that's not entirely right, because I think the protesters feel that the opposition parties in Turkey have really let them down, have mounted a very weak challenge to this government. And some of them are saying, you know, the reason we're here is that the actual political opposition has been so ineffective. But I think the platform would, you know, the broadest way I would describe their platform would be, don't intervene in people's lifestyles, just because they're not the lifestyles of the people who voted for this government, which tend to be a little more conservative and a little more religious. That's fine. People can behave in that way, of course. They're the majority in the country, as we saw in the election. But don't use that majority to start imposing other people's lifestyles on the lifestyles of the people who are out in the square, which are quite different, which are perhaps more secular, perhaps in some ways more European.